On a bitter January morning in 1981, James Whittaker stepped into the service elevator at the rear of the State Department building in Washington, D.C., balancing a stack of classified file folders against his chest and thinking about nothing more consequential than whether he had remembered to turn off the coffee maker in his office. The elevator lurched upward with its usual arthritic groan, climbing from the basement archives toward the third floor where Whittaker worked as a mid-level analyst in the Bureau of European Affairs. He had made this journey thousands of times over his 12 years of government service, riding in the same cramped metal box that smelled perpetually of industrial cleaner and old paper, listening to the same mechanical wheeze of cables and pulleys that had been installed when the building was constructed in the 1960s. He expected the elevator to deliver him to his floor with its customary reliability, allowing him to begin another ordinary day of reviewing intelligence reports and drafting policy memoranda. He had no reason to suspect that a mechanical failure, occurring at precisely the wrong moment, would expose one of the most damaging penetrations of American intelligence in Cold War history. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. James Whittaker was 47 years old that January, a career State Department officer who had spent more than 2 decades navigating the bureaucratic labyrinth of American foreign policy. He had joined the department fresh out of Georgetown University in 1959, drawn by the idealistic notion that diplomacy could prevent the kind of catastrophic conflict that had consumed his father's generation. His early assignments had taken him to embassies in London and Paris, where he had performed the unglamorous work that sustained diplomatic missions, processing visa applications, organizing receptions for visiting dignitaries, and drafting cables that translated policy directives into actionable instructions for field personnel. He was competent, but not brilliant. Diligent, but not ambitious. The kind of mid-level functionary who formed the connective tissue of government operations without ever attracting particular notice or acclaim. By 1970, Whittaker had returned to Washington and settled into a position analyzing Soviet affairs, a specialty he had developed during a posting to the American Embassy in Moscow from 1965 to 1968. Those years in the Soviet capital had been formative, exposing him to the reality of life behind the Iron Curtain and deepening his understanding of how the communist system functioned. He had learned to read between the lines of Pravda editorials, to interpret the significance of personnel changes in the Politburo, to recognize the subtle signals that Soviet officials used to communicate policy shifts. His colleagues respected his expertise, though they sometimes found him pedantic in his insistence on precise analysis and his reluctance to make bold, predictive judgments. Whittaker preferred facts to speculation, documentation to intuition, and he built his career on careful, methodical work that rarely produced dramatic insights, but consistently provided reliable information. The elevator was halfway between the first and second floors when it happened. The cables jerked, the car shuddered violently, and then everything stopped. The overhead light flickered once and went out, plunging Whittaker into complete darkness. The stack of folders slipped from his hands, scattering papers across the elevator floor with a sound like dry leaves in autumn wind. Whittaker stood perfectly still for a moment, his heart accelerating as his eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness. The elevator hung suspended in the shaft, swaying slightly, creating a nauseating sense of instability. He could hear the building's ambient sounds muffled by the metal walls, distant voices and footsteps, and the hum of ventilation systems continuing their normal operations while he remained trapped in this suddenly very small, very dark space. Whitaker felt along the wall until his fingers found the emergency phone, a red box mounted beside the control panel. He lifted the receiver and heard nothing. Not even static. The phone was dead, another victim of whatever electrical failure had stopped the elevator. He replaced the receiver and took a deep breath, trying to calm the flutter of panic that was beginning to build in his chest. He was not claustrophobic, not exactly, but the darkness and the confined space and the complete isolation from the building's normal activity created a primitive anxiety that he struggled to suppress through rational thought. Someone would notice soon, he told himself. The building maintenance staff monitored the elevators. They would realize one had stopped, and they would send help. He just needed to wait calmly until rescue arrived. Whitaker knelt carefully in the darkness, running his hands across the elevator floor to gather the scattered papers. His fingers brushed against file folders and loose sheets, and he began collecting them into a pile, trying to impose some order on the chaos, even though he could not see what he was doing. As he worked, his hand encountered something unexpected. A folder that felt different from the others, slightly larger, and made of heavier cardboard. He picked it up and ran his fingers across its surface, feeling the raised impression of a classification stamp and what seemed to be a handwritten notation along the edge. This folder had not been in his stack, he was certain of it. He had been carrying 5 folders from the archives, all of them standard manila file holders containing routine intelligence summaries. This was something else, something that had been lying on the elevator floor before the breakdown, left behind by a previous passenger. Whitaker sat back against the elevator wall, holding the mystery folder and waiting for rescue. Time passed with excruciating slowness in the darkness. He had no watch with a luminous dial, no way to judge how long he had been trapped. It might have been 10 minutes, or 30 minutes, or an hour. The silence pressed against his ears, broken only by his own breathing and the occasional distant sound of the building's mechanical systems. He thought about his wife Ellen, waiting for him to call during his morning break, a ritual they had maintained for years. He thought about the budget meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock that he would certainly miss. He thought about anything except the darkness and the enclosed space and the disorienting sensation of hanging suspended in the shaft. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably closer to 45 minutes, Whitaker heard voices above him, muffled but distinct. Someone was calling down the shaft, asking if anyone was inside the elevator. Whitaker shouted back, identifying himself and confirming he was uninjured but unable to open the doors. The voices conferred, and then he heard the distinctive sound of tools working on metal, a rhythmic clanging that gradually grew louder. The maintenance crew was manually opening the shaft doors on the floor above, preparing to help him escape through the emergency hatch in the elevator ceiling. 20 minutes later, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness as someone pried open the ceiling hatch. A maintenance worker named Eddie Torres, whom Whitaker recognized from countless brief encounters in the building's hallways, peered down at him with a reassuring grin. "You okay down there, Mr. Whitaker? We're gonna get you out. Just need you to climb up through here when we lower the ladder." The extraction process was awkward and undignified, requiring Whitaker to climb an aluminum ladder while Torres and another maintenance worker pulled him through the narrow ceiling hatch and then helped him scramble onto the second-floor landing. Whitaker emerged into the fluorescent-lit hallway, feeling disheveled and vaguely embarrassed, his suit dusty and his dignity somewhat compromised by the ungraceful exit. He thanked Torres and his colleague, assured them he was fine, and gathered his folders, including the mysterious one he had found in the darkness. Back in his office, Whitaker took a moment to compose himself before examining the folder he had discovered. The morning's adventure had left him shaken in ways he had not fully processed, and he needed coffee and a few minutes of normal routine before dealing with additional complications. But eventually, curiosity overcame his desire to simply forget the incident and return to his scheduled work. He opened the folder and began reading. What he found made his blood run cold. The folder contained photocopied pages from classified intelligence reports about American satellite reconnaissance capabilities over the Soviet Union. There were technical specifications for KH-11 reconnaissance satellites, including orbital parameters and imaging resolution capabilities. There were copies of actual satellite photographs showing Soviet military installations with detailed annotations identifying specific structures and equipment. Most damning, there were several pages of typed analysis discussing American intelligence collection priorities and the methods used to task satellites for specific surveillance missions. Everything in the folder was classified at the top secret level, some of it marked with additional caveats indicating special compartmented information that was restricted to individuals with specific clearances and documented need-to-know access. Whitaker sat at his desk, staring at the documents and trying to understand what he was looking at. This was not routine intelligence material of the kind that might legitimately be carried between offices for briefings or analysis. This was highly sensitive information about collection systems, the kind of material that revealed not just what America knew about Soviet capabilities, but how America obtained that knowledge. Compromising such information could allow the Soviets to develop countermeasures, to hide facilities or activities from overhead surveillance, to understand the limitations and vulnerabilities of American intelligence gathering. This was exactly the kind of material that Soviet intelligence services desperately wanted to acquire, the crown jewels of American technical espionage. The question that dominated Whitaker's thoughts as he reviewed the documents was simple and terrifying. What was this folder doing in the service elevator? Someone had been carrying it, had dropped it, or left it behind, and that someone worked in this building with access to extremely sensitive intelligence. The implications were staggering. Either this was a catastrophic security violation by someone authorized to handle the material who had been criminally careless, or this was evidence of active espionage, someone deliberately gathering classified information for unauthorized purposes. Whitaker knew what he had to do, though every instinct urged him to simply put the folder back where he had found it and pretend he had never seen it. Reporting this discovery would trigger an investigation that would disrupt the entire building, subject dozens of people to interrogation and suspicion, and quite possibly destroy careers, including potentially his own, if investigators decided he was somehow complicit. But the alternative, ignoring evidence of a potential security breach because acting on it would be inconvenient, violated everything Whitaker believed about duty and responsibility. He had spent his career serving American interests. He could not look away when those interests were potentially being betrayed from within. Whitaker picked up his phone and dialed the extension for building security, his hand trembling slightly as he pressed the numbers. When the duty officer answered, Whitaker identified himself and said he needed to report a possible security incident. Could someone come to his office immediately? The duty officer, a retired Marine named Harrison, who had worked building security for 15 years, asked what kind of incident. Whitaker hesitated, then said he would prefer to discuss it in person. Harrison said he would be there in 5 minutes. When Harrison arrived, accompanied by a younger security officer, Whitaker showed them the folder and explained how he had found it. Both men's expressions grew progressively more serious as they examined the documents. Harrison asked Whitaker to write down everything he could remember about his time in the elevator, every detail of how he had discovered the folder, exactly where it had been positioned on the floor. The questions came rapid-fire, precise, suggesting Harrison understood immediately that this was far more serious than a typical security violation. Within an hour, Whitaker's small office was crowded with people whose presence there would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. 2 agents from the FBI's Washington field office, a counterintelligence specialist from the State Department's Bureau of Diplomatic Security, and a grim-faced man who identified himself only as being from another agency, which Whitaker understood to mean the CIA. They asked him to repeat his story multiple times, pressing for details he had not thought significant, asking about other people he might have seen in the hallway near the elevator, whether he had noticed anyone behaving strangely in recent days, whether he had any reason to suspect any of his colleagues of security violations. The questions made Whitaker profoundly uncomfortable. He was being asked to inform on people he had worked alongside for years, to cast suspicion on colleagues who were probably innocent of any wrongdoing. But he also recognized that the FBI agents were simply doing their jobs, following procedures designed to identify security threats. He answered as honestly as he could, providing names of people who regularly used the service elevator, describing the building's normal patterns of activity, offering whatever information might help narrow down who could have been carrying the classified folder. One of the FBI agents, a woman in her mid-30s who introduced herself as Special Agent Lisa Brennan, seemed particularly interested in the physical characteristics of the folder itself. She examined it with meticulous care, noting that it showed signs of wear, suggesting it had been handled frequently. The photocopies inside were high quality, made on professional equipment rather than a standard office copier. Most tellingly, someone had made handwritten notes in the margins of several pages, annotations in blue ink that appeared to be in English, but used an unusual shorthand that might be a personal note-taking system, or possibly a simple code. Agent Brennan asked if Whitaker could identify the handwriting. He studied the notations carefully, comparing them mentally to the writing styles of colleagues whose work he reviewed regularly. Something about the annotations nagged at his memory, a familiar quality he could not quite place. The letters were formed with a distinctive slant, and certain characters had unusual flourishes that he had seen before, though he could not immediately recall where. He told Brennan he would think about it, that perhaps if he reviewed documents from various analysts in his section, he might be able to identify a match. Over the next 3 days, James Whitaker's professional life transformed into something resembling a counterintelligence investigation training exercise. FBI agents established themselves in a conference room down the hall from his office, using it as a command post for an operation that rapidly expanded beyond the simple question of who had lost the classified folder. Whitaker was asked to continue his normal work routine while discreetly observing his colleagues, noting who seemed nervous or distracted, who changed their behavior patterns, who might be showing signs of guilt or anxiety. He felt like a spy in his own office, watching people he considered friends, and wondering whether any of them might be betraying their country. The investigation proceeded with methodical thoroughness. Building security reviewed access logs for the service elevator, identifying everyone who had used their electronic badges to enter the restricted areas where the elevator operated. The FBI interviewed maintenance staff, asking about their observations of State Department personnel and whether they had noticed anyone behaving suspiciously around the elevator. Technical specialists examined the elevator itself, checking for hidden compartments or dead-drop locations where material might be concealed for later retrieval. Every stone was turned, every possibility explored, but no clear suspect emerged from the initial inquiries. Agent Brennan kept Whitaker informed of the investigation's progress, recognizing that his cooperation was essential and that he deserved to understand what his discovery had set in motion. She explained that the classified folder represented a systematic collection effort rather than a one-time security lapse. The documents came from multiple sources and had been assembled over time, suggesting someone was deliberately gathering intelligence about American satellite reconnaissance capabilities. The photocopying indicated planning and premeditation. This was not accidental. This was espionage. On the fourth day after Whitaker's discovery, he was reviewing a routine intelligence summary when something caught his eye. The document had been drafted by a colleague named Martin Kowalski, a senior analyst who had worked in the Soviet Affairs section for nearly 8 years. Whitaker had collaborated with Kowalski on numerous projects and considered him a competent, if somewhat aloof, colleague. Kowalski's writing style was distinctive, precise, and analytical, with a tendency toward long, complex sentences that packed multiple clauses into single units of thought. But what arrested Whitaker's attention was not the writing style. It was the handwritten correction Kowalski had made in blue ink at the bottom of the page, amending a date reference with the same distinctive slant and character formation that Whitaker had seen in the annotations on the classified folder. Whitaker felt his stomach clench. He pulled out copies of the annotated pages from the classified folder that the FBI had given him for comparison purposes. He laid them beside Kowalski's memo, studying the handwriting with the careful attention to detail that had defined his analytical career. The match was not perfect. People naturally varied their handwriting depending on circumstances, but the similarities were striking. The way certain letters connected, the angle of the downstrokes, the formation of numbers, all suggested the same hand had written both sets of annotations. Whitaker called Agent Brennan immediately. She arrived within 15 minutes, reviewed the comparison Whitaker had prepared, and agreed that the similarities warranted investigation. She asked what Whitaker knew about Martin Kowalski, both professionally and personally. Whitaker provided what information he could. Kowalski was 52 years old, a career State Department analyst who had joined the Foreign Service in the early 1960s. He had served in various postings throughout Europe, including 2 years in Moscow from 1973 to 1975. He was considered an expert on Soviet military capabilities and had written extensively about Warsaw Pact Force structures. He lived alone in an apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, had never married, and maintained what seemed to be a quiet, solitary lifestyle focused primarily on his work. Nothing in Kowalski's background immediately suggested espionage, but Agent Brennan explained that the most successful spies were often those who appeared most normal, who attracted no attention and raised no suspicions. The FBI would need to investigate Kowalski thoroughly, examining his finances, his travel history, his contacts, his access to the classified material found in the folder. If evidence emerged that he was the source, they would need to determine whether he was working alone or as part of a larger network, and most critically, whether he was acting for financial gain or ideological commitment. The investigation of Martin Kowalski proceeded with extreme discretion. The FBI could not afford to alert him that he was under suspicion, both because doing so might cause him to flee or destroy evidence, and because if he were part of a spy network, exposing him prematurely might allow his accomplices to escape detection. Whitaker was instructed to maintain normal professional relations with Kowalski, to give no indication that anything had changed. It was one of the most difficult things Whitaker had ever been asked to do, sitting in meetings with a man who might be a Soviet agent, discussing classified intelligence while wondering whether every word was being memorized for later transmission to Moscow. FBI surveillance teams began monitoring Kowalski's movements outside the State Department building. They watched his apartment, followed him to restaurants and bookstores, documented his routine with patient thoroughness. For the first week, Kowalski's behavior appeared entirely innocuous. He went to work, returned home, occasionally visited a neighborhood deli, or spent evenings at a library. He made no suspicious contacts, conducted no obvious espionage tradecraft, gave no indication that he was anything other than what he appeared to be, a dedicated government analyst with few interests beyond his professional work. But on the 8th day of surveillance, Kowalski did something that justified the FBI's attention. On a Saturday afternoon, he drove to a park in Arlington, walked to a specific bench overlooking a small pond, and sat reading a newspaper for approximately 30 minutes. Then he stood, walked to a trash receptacle near the park entrance, and deposited the newspaper along with what appeared to be a small envelope that had been concealed inside the folded pages. He left the park and drove home, his behavior suggesting nothing unusual except for the timing and location, which surveillance teams recognized as consistent with a dead-drop operation. FBI agents retrieved the envelope from the trash receptacle and found it contained a microfilm cassette. When developed and enlarged, the microfilm revealed photographs of classified documents about American intelligence assessments of Soviet strategic forces, exactly the kind of material that would be of intense interest to Soviet intelligence services. The film also contained a brief typed message in English mentioning a schedule for future communications and requesting payment for services rendered. The evidence was damning. Martin Kowalski was not simply careless with classified material. He was actively engaged in espionage, photographing documents and passing them to a foreign intelligence service through established tradecraft procedures. Agent Brennan briefed Whitaker on these developments in a secure conference room, her expression a mixture of satisfaction at having identified a spy and concern about the damage Kowalski might have already caused. She explained that the FBI now faced a critical decision. They could arrest Kowalski immediately, securing him before he could destroy additional evidence or flee the country. Or they could continue surveillance, allowing him to lead them to his handlers and potentially exposing a larger network. The decision would be made at higher levels, but Brennan wanted Whitaker to understand the stakes of what his elevator discovery had revealed. The FBI chose to continue surveillance while secretly searching Kowalski's apartment. A covert entry team, operating with a warrant authorized under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, entered the apartment while Kowalski was at work and conducted a thorough examination of his possessions. What they found confirmed the worst suspicions. Hidden inside a hollowed-out book on Kowalski's shelf was a Minox camera, the spy's traditional tool for photographing documents. Tucked behind a heating vent were 3 additional microfilm cassettes containing classified material. Most significantly, agents discovered a coded message pad, the kind used to encrypt communications with intelligence handlers, along with one-time pad sheets that would allow Kowalski to decode instructions received from his Soviet controllers. The evidence was overwhelming. Martin Kowalski had been operating as a Soviet agent for an unknown period, systematically photographing classified documents to which his position gave him access, and passing that intelligence to his handlers through dead drops and possibly other communication methods. The damage he had caused was potentially catastrophic, compromising American intelligence capabilities and revealing sensitive information about collection methods and analytical conclusions. On February 23, 1981, exactly 7 weeks after James Whitaker had been trapped in a broken elevator, FBI agents arrested Martin Kowalski as he arrived at work. They took him into custody without incident, executing a search warrant for his office that revealed additional classified documents Kowalski had been preparing to photograph. Under interrogation, Kowalski initially denied everything, claiming the materials found in his apartment had been planted by investigators seeking to frame him. But faced with the microfilm evidence, the camera, the coding materials, and the detailed surveillance, documentation of his dead drop activities, Kowalski's resistance eventually crumbled. What emerged from his confession was a story of ideological betrayal that had begun nearly a decade earlier. Kowalski revealed that he had been recruited by Soviet intelligence during his posting to Moscow in the mid-1970s. Disillusioned by what he perceived as American imperial aggression and attracted to the egalitarian promises of Soviet communism, Kowalski had agreed to provide information to a KGB officer who had befriended him during his time in the Soviet capital. The relationship had been carefully cultivated, built on intellectual discussions about political philosophy and strategic theory, gradually leading Kowalski to see himself not as a traitor, but as someone working toward a more just world order. After returning to Washington, Kowalski had maintained contact with his handlers through a sophisticated communication system that included dead drops, coded messages in classified advertisements, and occasional meetings with Soviet diplomats who had legitimate reasons to be in the United States. He had provided intelligence on American strategic assessments, satellite reconnaissance capabilities, and analytical conclusions about Soviet military modernization. He estimated he had passed thousands of pages of classified material over the years, receiving modest payments that he claimed were not his primary motivation. He insisted he had acted out of principle, believing the information he provided would contribute to mutual understanding and reduce the risk of war between the superpowers. The FBI analysts who reviewed Kowalski's espionage activities concluded that his betrayal had caused significant damage to American intelligence capabilities. The Soviets now knew details about American satellite reconnaissance that would allow them to develop countermeasures. They possessed analytical assessments that revealed American understanding of Soviet capabilities, allowing them to calibrate their own military planning accordingly. They had gained insights into American intelligence collection priorities that could help them identify and protect their most sensitive activities. The full extent of the damage might never be completely known, but it was substantial enough to warrant major reassessments of intelligence programs and collection methodologies. Martin Kowalski was charged with espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, and multiple counts of unauthorized disclosure of classified information. His trial, held before a federal judge with appropriate security clearances, resulted in conviction on all counts. He was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, a term that effectively meant he would spend the rest of his life in confinement. The case attracted significant media attention, though many details remained classified, and Kowalski became another name in the long list of Americans who had betrayed their country during the Cold War. For James Whitaker, the resolution of the case brought a complex mixture of feelings. He had done his duty by reporting what he found, and his actions had led to the identification and arrest of a spy who might otherwise have continued operating for years. But he took no pleasure in Kowalski's downfall, only a weary recognition that betrayal could come from anyone, even colleagues who appeared dedicated to their work and loyal to their country. The experience had shattered some of Whitaker's innocence about the world he inhabited, forcing him to acknowledge that the espionage threat was not abstract or distant, but present within his own office, perpetrated by someone he had worked alongside for years. The FBI presented Whitaker with a letter of commendation from the director, acknowledging his crucial role in identifying a significant security threat. The letter was classified and could not be shared publicly, but it provided validation that his decision to report the discovered folder despite the personal and professional disruption it caused, had been the right choice. Agent Brennan, in a final meeting to close out the investigation, told Whitaker that the broken elevator had been, in a perverse way, one of the most productive equipment failures in counterintelligence history. Without that mechanical breakdown, Kowalski might have retrieved the folder he had dropped or left behind, and his espionage activities might have continued undetected. Whitaker returned to his normal work routine, though he never quite recaptured the comfortable sense of security he had felt before that January morning in the elevator. He became more cautious about handling classified material, more attentive to security procedures, more aware of the constant threat posed by insiders who might betray their oaths and responsibilities. He learned to live with a slight paranoia, a background awareness that the colleagues he trusted might not be worthy of that trust, that vigilance was not optional, but essential. The service elevator was repaired and returned to operation within days of Whitaker's entrapment, its mechanical failure attributed to a worn cable that had finally given way under years of stress. Building maintenance installed a new cable and upgraded the emergency communication system to prevent future incidents. The elevator resumed its role as an unremarkable piece of infrastructure, carrying people and materials between floors with renewed reliability. Few people who used it knew about its accidental contribution to national security, about the classified folder discovered in its darkness, about the investigation that had begun with a maintenance breakdown. Years later, after the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had collapsed, declassified documents revealed the full scope of the intelligence network that Martin Kowalski had been part of. He was not, as it turned out, a lone operator, but rather one node in a larger Soviet intelligence operation that had penetrated multiple American government agencies. His arrest had triggered a cascade of investigations that ultimately exposed several other agents and led to significant improvements in security procedures. The broken elevator, the found folder, and James Whitaker's decision to report what he had discovered had contributed to rolling up a network that might otherwise have compromised American intelligence for years longer. Whitaker retired from the State Department in 1995, completing a 36-year career that had been marked by quiet competence and one extraordinary moment of consequence. He never spoke publicly about his role in the Kowalski case, respecting the confidentiality agreements he had signed and believing that his contribution was too modest to merit attention. But privately, in conversations with his wife, Ellen, and occasionally with former colleagues who had security clearances sufficient to discuss classified matters, he would reflect on that January morning when a mechanical failure had exposed a human betrayal. What stayed with Whitaker most powerfully was the randomness of it all, the contingent nature of the discovery that had unraveled Kowalski's espionage. If the elevator had not broken down at that precise moment, if Whitaker had not knelt in the darkness to gather scattered papers, if his fingers had not brushed against that distinctive folder, the course of events would have been entirely different. Kowalski might have retrieved his dropped material, might have continued his espionage for years, might never have been caught. The machinery of counterintelligence, for all its sophistication and resources, had been defeated by a spy who had operated successfully for nearly a decade. What finally exposed him was not brilliant investigation or advanced surveillance technology, but a broken elevator and one observant analyst who recognized that something was wrong. The lesson Whitaker drew from the experience was humbling and profound. Security, he came to understand, depended ultimately not on systems and procedures alone, but on individuals who remained alert to anomalies, who asked questions when things did not fit expected patterns, who had the courage to report concerns even when doing so might be personally uncomfortable. The elaborate counterintelligence apparatus that protected American secrets could only function if ordinary people, going about their daily work, maintained awareness and responsibility for the security of the information they handled. James Whittaker died in 2008 at the age of 74, his obituary mentioning his long State Department career but making no reference to his role in exposing a Soviet spy. The classified letter of commendation remained in a secure file somewhere in FBI archives, known to only a handful of people who had clearance to access historical counterintelligence records. But those who had worked the Kowalski case remembered Whittaker's contribution, remembered that a routine elevator ride had become an extraordinary counterintelligence breakthrough because one analyst had paid attention to something that did not belong. The building where it all happened still stands in Washington, D.C., its service elevator continuing to carry classified material and government employees between floors. New generations of analysts and administrators use it without knowing its history, without realizing that decades ago, a mechanical failure in that same shaft led to one of the Cold War's more unusual espionage discoveries. The elevator itself is unremarkable, just another piece of aging infrastructure in a city filled with buildings where history has unfolded in unexpected ways. But for those who understand what happened there, in January 1981, the elevator represents something important about the nature of intelligence work and national security. It stands as a reminder that the most sophisticated operations can be undone by random chance, that vigilance matters in ways both large and small, and that sometimes the difference between security and catastrophe comes down to whether one person in the right place at the right time recognizes that something is wrong and has the courage to act on that recognition. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.